Well, welcome to our seminar as we look at husband and wife gospel partnerships. Kate and I have had the pleasure of catching up at coffee shops a few times in the last couple of months, talking about how we were going to prepare this seminar and how to approach it. And we decided the best approach was to tell the story of our life and ministry together with our husbands and reflect on what has helped develop that partnership. Julia asked us to do a bit of an introduction to ourselves at the beginning, but we're actually going to slowly introduce ourselves as we tell our story as we go. We hope this seminar today will help you to think creatively about what a husband and wife gospel partnership can look like as you listen to our stories. To be thinking about your own church husbands and wives or your own Christian community husbands and wives, and whether there's anything that can be done to develop these relationships more in ministry service. We know that lots of husbands and wives work together in ministry, but we want to look specifically at where they're working more closely in the same ministry together, like Priscilla and Aquila. We're going to think a little bit about how God regularly in his goodness uses challenges in our lives to grow our relationships with him, but also with each other. And you'll see as we go along, it's really not a model partnership in any way. You'll hear the good and the bad from us. And often we haven't intentionally developed that partnership. And there are definite positives and negatives to working so closely together. We're aiming to be more descriptive than prescriptive. We're not saying this is for everyone. And we want to encourage and affirm women and husbands and wives in the ministries they're involved in all their shapes and sizes. And hopefully by the end of the seminar, we'll have persuaded you that these are great partnerships worth pursuing. Well, let's see if we can do all of that in an hour. Well, I am married to Mike, who is here today at the back of the seminar, so it's lovely to have you here. And usually often the question we get asked is, how did you meet? Well, we met at uni. We were both doing different degrees and involved in different things. But at the time, we both separately had an interest in Muslim ministry. So Mike through a short-term trip with his church to North India, and me through my campus group that was very keen on missions and through meeting Muslim students on campus. We had both decided individually to work for a few years and then head to college and then head off to the mission field. I'd planned to go single. My mother and her ladies' Bible study had other ideas. And before we met, Michael, on that mission trip, had developed chronic fatigue after picking up some mysterious bug that's still never been identified in North India, coming back very ill and then developing chronic fatigue. But by the time we met, he'd recovered from that, and so we got to know each other. After getting married, we worked in our professions and then headed off to SMBC in 2000. Yes, that's how old I am. But the 8 months before college, we actually backpacked together through different Muslim countries or countries with significant Muslim communities, visiting missionaries, checking out mission organisations and thinking through the specific ministry issues we'd need to consider as we prepared for missionary service. We didn't realise it was the beginning of that husband and wife ministry partnership, spending each day with each other in very cheap, small accommodation, travelling together. And I heard someone say once, doing dining table theology or dinner table theology, discussing what we'd seen, what we'd heard, the conversations we'd had during the day, and thinking through those theologically. God was preparing us for the years ahead when there would be just the two of us working alongside each other. Well, that continued into college study. We both did the same degree, same classes, same assignments. We studied both full-time for 3 years. At the time, and I don't think this is the case maybe for any theological college, it was free for spouses to study. And so in our year alone, there were 5 couples all studying at degree level who had all gone to college to study that way, hadn't met at college. Our life was very much in sync. We lived in one room for those 3 years, and God developed in us an ability to work very closely together and tolerate each other for long periods of time. We learnt a little bit to deal with our competitiveness over marks. And we took those issues we'd uncovered during our travel and pulled them apart at college, thinking theologically about those issues and also about ministry strategies and solutions. We headed off to St Andrew's Hall, and while we were there we did the Myers-Briggs thing and discovered that we're almost identical, which is really interesting, probably helpful for a husband-wife gospel partnership. Well, in 2004, we headed off to a Muslim megacity in South Asia with CMS. It was one of the cities we'd visited during our travels before college, an area under-resourced in terms of mission personnel and a struggling persecuted church. We went to language school together, and the lessons in comparison and competition continued with our marks. We were doing the same study together, and wow, the locals were very honest about who they thought was better at their language learning than the other. During our first year, we went to live with a Muslim family in a village for 8 months. So we were taking what we'd done in language school and practicing it, applying it. From day one, we had 30 people looking through the window into our room. I wore a sari 24 hours a day. We had chilies for breakfast. We showered at a tube well. We lived in 40 plus degrees with days with just fans and sometimes no fans at all. We were slowly learning the language, but also observing the culture from the inside, beyond being guests when everyone's polite to you. And we got both perspectives of the culture and very different opportunities to talk about Christ. We saw how a family unit operated, problems between a mother and a daughter-in-law, and the very separate worlds of men and women. Now, the place we were in South Asia is not strictly segregated, but those worlds pretty much all the time operated separately. Mike was out and about with the sons of the family, returning late at night, having had all these great experiences. I was cloistered at home with the women doing domestic duties. We were both learning the different worlds of men and women and bridges into the gospel. We were having very different conversations and realising that one approach to sharing the gospel with men and women wouldn't work, and that it needed both of us sharing in our own ways, in our own environments. In that culture, men and women marry at different ages, so often a 30-ish man will marry a 16-year-old wife. They live very, very different lives. There's the segregation and the modesty and head coverings and being at home. And for women who were mostly uneducated or illiterate, the world of folk Islam and superstition and going to the witch doctor and the healer was much stronger. So while Michael was out talking to people, opening up the Quran and the Bible and having these great apologetics discussions, I was listening to women talking about cooking and kids and finding out all of their folk beliefs at home. Very, very different lives. And we learnt to read the Bible through the eyes of a different culture. Passages on head covering and women were no-brainers. Of course you covered your head to pray. All of those things just made sense in that culture. And historically, in that place, more men were coming to faith than women. And the reasons were multiple. More trained male evangelists, male-focused strategies, men out and about hearing new ideas, and the belief that it would trickle down to the women in their family. So the men as the decision makers would come to Christ and then the women would hear. But it just didn't work that way. The gap between men and women was so huge, and often husbands thought their wives were too ignorant to understand the gospel, or worried that their wives would divorce them if they heard they'd become a Christian. And it was interesting. In Australia, there are differences between men and women, and occasionally we see the problem of a husband and wife or wife separately coming to faith as sort of an unavoidable occasional side effect. But it took us to go to another culture where you see the differences between men and women and the impact on the family to realise actually how key it is for, if possible, husbands and wives or families to come to Christ. And in Australia, we don't tend to think about that. It takes often a communal culture to start thinking in terms of those relationships. At the end of our first year, we moved to the capital, to a suburb in that city that had the largest concentration of Muslim background believers, 200 people in 2 million people. So think about your church and how amazing it is that you have so many Christians there. There had been some missionaries there in the past, but now there were none, and our focus was on training and discipling the Christians who were there to help them develop the church. At the time, we were the only missionaries in our suburb, and we prayed for God to grow a team. But until that happened, we were the only support and encouragement for each other. And we could see the value in God training us to work so closely together and providing that training for both of us at college. As we discussed our conversations, our questions, as we continued that dinner table theology together. So life on an everyday basis was Mike at the office, working as an engineer, and me with my neighbourhood women, doing evangelism with my neighbours, being involved in a women's Bible study in a slum, training women, and not being able to travel very much because it was looked down upon as immodest. Men and women working separately but also together. We had the opportunity to work with husbands and wives in the church and also to host a house church in our home of men and women and to be able to work with those husbands and wives together. There were not only gaps between local men and women but also the missionaries that we spent time with. In our first term we joined a network of missionaries from a dozen or so different countries and 8 different organisations, and realised that while usually the men had a reasonable level of theological training, formal theological training, this was sadly not the case for the women. Some women had come to the field with only 3 weeks of cross-cultural training and no formal theological training at all. And so I began working with a committee to run twice-yearly conferences for female missionaries, Bible teaching, pastoral care for them as they struggled living in a Muslim culture and cultural issues. Women would come from hundreds of kilometres away to the day to connect with other women and to learn and grow. They were either single women with a working visa, so very little time left over to do word ministry, or women married with kids and being the main carer for their children, so very little time left over to run a family and household. And across the country, little time or attention was given to women reaching women. And for the gospel to go out amongst these women, we realised we needed trained women who would train others. We needed husbands and wives equipped to work together in gospel ministry. The cultural issues we'd seen amongst Muslims were also seen in the Muslim background church. So even though we had a mixed house church that we hosted, often the women would say very little in front of the men. So we needed separate women's groups. The age difference and the education difference made it just such a difficult group to be able to target a Bible study to. And so many of the women couldn't read the Bible at all. And obvious modesty issues. Michael couldn't go to lead a women's group in a house because all the neighbours would say, "Who's this man who's not your husband?" And so few of them had opportunity to travel to another group. It had to be something in their neighbourhood. In our second term, we had our first child, Matthew, and our lives changed completely. Looking after a baby in a developing country was really hard work. We took him back from Australia at 6 weeks of age and had this little baby we used public transport, we caught rickshaws, there were no parks or playgrounds, no mothers' groups. We didn't even have a washing machine because no one in our suburb had a washing machine. Everything took more time and was more isolated. But one of the blessings of being missionaries was that we didn't have fixed job descriptions, well, in our type of missionary work. We could work out our own schedules, our own hours. We had no fixed roles or responsibilities. So because we didn't have those fixed things, we could discuss who would look after the kids. So I was the main carer while our children were young, but gradually this shifted until we were dividing up the week to decide who would be caring for our kids and who would be out doing word ministry. So we had that conversation. And one person's ministry was not seen as more important than the others. We just looked at how men's and women's lives worked and worked out who needed to be out at that time and who needed to be looking after our kids. But by the end of our second term, the work was really taking its toll. We didn't have great self-care strategies. We had a tendency to rely on our own strength and not on God. And it was a really hard field to live and work in. At the time, it was the least livable city in the world. Now, think of all the places in the world and how horrible they are on the news. This was the least livable of all of them. There were complex church and ministry issues, having small children, having regular illness. We had a line of stool sample containers, empty ones, always in our cupboard, ready to go. And we're both heavily involved in ministry, and we both ended up getting burnout. So that's one of the negative sides of being so closely involved in ministry together, and particularly in a place with not many support structures or other people. When we were both unwell, the question was who cared for us? And it was hard to get support from a long way away. And because we'd been there the longest, we were the team leaders. And so we were always helping people to settle in and always expected to be the people with wise words and to have it together. Well, while I recovered from burnout, Mike's became what we think is a relapse of his chronic fatigue from many years ago. One day he was going to the local gym as usual to run on the running machine and came home feeling more exhausted than refreshed after having exercised. He got flu-like symptoms, achy muscles, feeling tired, and so we just assumed he was getting the flu all the time and that he would recover. Probably the biggest struggle with chronic fatigue initially is being able to work out what it is. We tried different things, keeping on thinking it was short term, and then eventually we came back to Australia for an extended home leave, seeing specialists, recovering. Chronic fatigue is not a real diagnosis. If anyone here has had experience with it, it's called a syndrome. It's when the doctor says, you've got this collection of symptoms, you've had it for 6 months or longer, so we'll call it chronic fatigue. But it's not treatable, it's not identifiable as a normal illness. It is debilitating and depressing and frustrating and boring an awful lot of the time when you're too tired to be able to do anything. The 16 months in Australia we had were really hard. Being in limbo land, not knowing whether we were going back to overseas or being in Australia, I didn't know whether to buy Western clothes or not. You know, all these decisions, you just don't know where you'll be. And because we worked so closely together, it was a decision about where we would live, what country we'd be in, what jobs we'd be doing. It was all tied very closely to Michael's health. Eventually, he was well enough to return to South Asia, and we went back for 4 months, but his health relapsed, and we knew we were heading back to Australia for good. This is my chance to say CMS is a fabulous organisation. They are incredibly supportive, very cautious, great people. Can't recommend them more highly in terms of an organisation, particularly at the tail end. I think as students at college, you think, what will it be like at the beginning? All the exciting questions. You don't ask the question, what if I get sick? What if things don't work out well? How will they look after me? So, bit of a plug there. I'm now working as the Families Minister at St John's Beecroft, and it's the first time in 16 years that Michael and I have worked separately. It's really strange. And there's a certain level of grief to it, because this is my ministry partner that I've worked really closely with. Our whole lives have been around ministry together. When we came back initially, we looked at this job and 2 others as possible job shares, thinking that if Michael's health improved, that I would do less and less work and that he would take on more. And splitting up roles, thinking about who would be the best. So Michael doing the preaching load, me meeting up with the mums from playgroup, just thinking more broadly about ministry and who was best fitted for it. We strongly believe in the value of husband and wife gospel partnerships, even in a structured role. More than one spouse working and their spouse partially involved. A ministry partnership where both partners' ministries are equally valued, reaching couples and families with the gospel. There are some elements of a role that women can do better than men. Playgroup mums makes sense for a woman to meet up with, and vice versa. And we believe that a church would actually get a good deal from this kind of a structured role. You'd get more gifts, more time, and I think fresher staff sharing that role. We had some great conversations with churches, but it's an unusual thing to see a structured, titled, paid job that's a husband and wife gospel partnership. There are very few examples to look to, and most of the churches we talked to had very practical questions about what it would look like. It takes a bit of a paradigm shift. So we're really excited to hear what Kate and Brian are going to be doing and what she's going to be talking about next in their role this year. We've done a whole range of things together over the years. Michael's given a sermon, I've done an application sidebar at the end, we've shared scripture classes together, we've served in children's ministry together, we've done a whole range of things, and it's been flexible over time. But sadly, Mike's health hasn't improved as we thought, and so I'm staying full-time in my role. Being the staff member at a church has taken some adjusting, and I think we're still adjusting. We've had some interesting conversations with people about headship and what it looks like to have a woman on staff but the husband not. And I think we're still adjusting to that. But it's also encouraged us that headship in our relationship is not necessarily tied to a role or Mike being the breadwinner, although society would tell us that. Michael is still the head of our family and our key decision maker, and has in some ways more time with our kids and leads them well than someone in a 70-hour-a-week job. I work with a great staff team at Beecroft, and particularly two great guys who encourage and challenge me in ministry and care for me well as I work and care for Michael. So as I finish up and I reflect back on these years of working in different ways together, what are some of the values that we've seen behind a good husband and wife gospel partnership, or what we've seen has been valuable? As I said, we believe in couples ministry, husbands and wives working together to reach husbands and wives as a unit where possible. It's mobile. Wherever we went, we've had a team. Even when there's no one else around, we are there to encourage, support, discuss things theologically. God has used our complementary gifts and skills. For example, my husband absolutely loves door-knocking evangelism, loves it. That's how, that's what we did initially in our relationship. I really don't. I'll do it, but and I'm the details person, and he's not. I'm the perfectionist who's more relaxed. He brings the funny into a talk, whereas I'm the super serious one. And I'm much more head-on, and he's more backdoor and passive. We use those gifts together. God uses those gifts together in different ways. A husband-wife gospel partnership, a good one, I think, is flexible. It changes over time and with circumstances, as your family changes, as your geography changes in different ways. The opportunities we've had to develop that have really been based on the opportunity for both of us to study full-time to degree level. And I realise we're unusual, but I'd really love to see our situations become more common. I'd love to see more husbands and wives both trained theologically to a degree level. Training isn't the be-all and end-all, but it can lead to not just being involved in ministry at church, but thinking more deeply theologically, contributing to and shaping the direction of the church from a female perspective, and as husbands and wives talking about that. Husband and wife gospel partnerships can be negative. You can be too closely linked. You can end up in situations where you're not able to care for each other, and it can lead to really boring conversations all just about work. So you'll need good outside support if that's something that you want to pursue. I was reading Ephesians 5 recently, verses 28 to 29. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. I'm very thankful as I reflect back on these years for a husband who has gone beyond providing for my basic physical needs, but has truly nourished and cherished me in many ways over the years, but particularly valuing and encouraging the ministries I'm involved in and working alongside me in gospel partnership. Thanks.
Well, what does a good gospel partnership look like in practice? As Joe's reflected and as I've reflected, we've realised there is no one answer to that question. And as I look around the room, I see a wealth of experience, and I'm sure that you could all give me a wise answer to that question. My husband Brian and I, we've only been married for 4 years, but in his providence, God has allowed us to face some unique highs and lows in our short marriage. And so in sharing my reflections with you today, I don't hold us out as a perfect example. As Joe said, we want to be descriptive, not prescriptive. And whatever your context, I hope that you might be encouraged by the ways that God has worked in us, and that you might even take some new thoughts home to ponder further. Well, Brian and I met here at Moore, and Joe's husband Mike's here, but I banned Brian, so he's upstairs. I was in my second year. I had very little time for first years when he arrived, so it wasn't until a year in that we finally met. I was living in Carillon and he was living in Chapo, and we had a delightful college romance. So we think that a good gospel partnership shares the same values and beliefs and purposes in life. And so we're so thankful that having met here, we knew right from the start that our marriage and our family life would be shaped by our common desire to serve God in vocational ministry. But we had different ideas about that. I came to college with the hope of being a school chaplain. I'd been converted at high school and I saw the value of being with young people, whereas Brian was keen on parish. And so we didn't foresee any conflict between those two ministries. We were actually really glad that we'd both be able to pursue our passion. There was another difference though. I'm from Sydney and Brian's from Perth, and I never intended to leave and he never intended to stay. So while our ministries weren't in conflict, the location was. And so we learned early on that partnering in ministry would mean compromise and sacrifice for both of us. For now, Brian is making that sacrifice and we're in Sydney. But after William's exhortation this morning, I'm wondering if we need to reconsider that. But when I graduated from Moore, I became the assistant chaplain at Barker College in Hornsby, and this was my dream job. Brian continued as a student here at college, and he would then eventually be an assistant minister. I absolutely loved my time at Barker. It is such a privilege to be involved in young people's lives when they're figuring out who they are and what they believe. What a great joy to walk alongside them in that. And I'd been there for 2 years when Brian needed to look for a job. And we were a bit nervous because I desperately wanted to stay at Barker, but we knew the chances of him getting a job close by would be slim. So then we were astounded when God provided Brian with a job at St Peter's, Hornsby. We could both live and do ministry in the very same parish. But the schedule of a school chaplain and a parish minister aren't exactly in sync. Schools like Barker have high expectations of their staff. I was required to coach Saturday sport for a semester, and I'd often be at evening functions. And so this meant that I just couldn't be as involved as I would have liked to be in church, and that Brian and I found it difficult to spend time together. We see that conflicting schedules and demands are commonplace in ministry marriages. We found a few things helpful. I asked school to be released from my Saturday sport commitment, and they very graciously allowed this to happen. We think that a good gospel partnership thrives when it is nourished. Rest and time together is so important, and we all know this and we've heard it many times before, and Joe's spoken to it, and yet it just seems to be so hard to put into practice sometimes, isn't it? I see so many of my peers struggling with that. But it's important, and so sometimes this means making sacrifices to other relationships. It can mean sacrifice to ministry even. It can mean difficult conversations with people asking for their flexibility, and it can mean making alternate arrangements. But we know that our partnership has benefited enormously from quality time together. I would have loved to do more at St Peter's while I was at Barker, but this is a tension that we just learnt to live with. We decided what I could and could not do early on. So I attended but did not lead a growth group. We hosted lunches in our home only fortnightly, and I attended 2 of 3 services on a Sunday. We were deliberate about assessing my limitations, and we were careful not to exceed them. So we really did thrive. We found it helpful for the congregations to know about my ministry at Barker because that allowed them to have realistic expectations of my involvement in church. And then we found that they then really valued and respected my ministry outside of church. So our ministries were not in conflict and in fact complemented each other. Brian and I partnering in ministry, even different ministries, meant that we were then able to strengthen the relationship between St Peter's and Barker, linking the Anglican school and the Anglican church in the same parish in a way that we hope will continue to be beneficial for both. However, there were limitations. It's been a long-held ambition of mine to be a senior chaplain in a school like Barker. I was an accountant many years ago, and I left that with that goal in mind. But then we got married and things changed, and as we worked together in ministry, I realised that I couldn't be a senior chaplain in a school if Brian were to be a rector in a church at the same time. We believe that both jobs are just too demanding, and a combination of the two would negatively impact both ministries and our marriage. We have seen other couples manage two demanding roles, but we know that's not us, and we don't think we could. And so we've agreed that we're both very willing to make sacrifices at different times. Each one of us is happy to take a less demanding job to allow the other to take a more demanding one. And we believe that's at the core of a good gospel partnership. We're not two individuals pursuing our own competing interests. We're a team, and we want to work together for the growth of the kingdom. Well, in 2016, last year, I left my chaplaincy role and I was just part-time at Barker 2 days a week. And so I had a lot more free time. And so without ever really planning it, Brian and I found ourselves working alongside each other in parish. In our marriage, we'd always encouraged each other to use our gifts, and now I had a new opportunity to do that in church in a way I hadn't before. And I found that I loved it. I'd never expected to like parish. I was so committed to schools, but turned out to be great. So I led 2 growth groups, I had more one-to-one discipleship opportunities and more involvement in planning and leading the services. We did something else a bit different. Twice in our 3 years, I was able to help Brian by joining him up the front during a sermon. We saw this modelled when we were at college by John Woodhouse and Jane Tour, and we just loved it, and we were keen to experiment with it ourselves. Both these sermons were on marriage, 1 Peter 3 and Ephesians 5. Brian began the sermon, and then he invited me to join him up the front and reflect on my experiences and understanding of the passage. The congregation loved this. The women in particular found it really helpful to have a female voice reflect on what marriage looks like. To be clear, I wouldn't give a sermon to an adult mixed congregation. We don't think that's appropriate. But Brian and I both felt comfortable with me joining him. We're still experimenting with this, still figuring it out. And this year we hope to be able to do it about once a term, choosing passages where we think having a woman reflect on application would be particularly helpful. As we worked together in parish last year, we had hugely positive feedback from the congregations. And we really believe that they benefited from having both of us serving them. We were able to model a gospel partnership up close, and they benefited from our different gifts and expertise and experience. Well, Brian was only 4 days a week at Hornsby, and so in addition to this, he worked as the weddings minister at Church Hill in the city. He took the majority of their weddings, and ran their marriage prep course. This was a group course that took place for 2 hours a week over 3 weeks, and the vast majority of couples who went through that were non-Christians. Brian did this on his own in 2015 while I was at Barker, but in 2016 I came on board to help. And so together we reworked what he'd done on his own. And Brian would agree that the new material is much richer. Our 2 perspectives, experiences and wisdom were so much more valuable than what he brought on his own. We think that having a husband and wife do marriage prep together is just invaluable. We know too many couples who've met only with the male minister for marriage prep, with little to no input from a woman. And look, I understand that there are limitations on wives' times, and they might not be able or willing to be involved in marriage prep. But if that is something you could do as a team, I think that's such an important area. I know that as a woman, I want to hear from mature, godly, wise older women on their experience of marriage, and I think Titus 2 encourages this. And so a couple meeting with the man alone just won't gain the same insight as meeting with both husband and wife. Well, while all this ministry at Barker and Hornsby and Church Hill was taking place, Brian and I were engaged in a battle with infertility. To cut a long story short, we have unexplained infertility, which is where the doctors know you're not getting pregnant, but despite a battery of tests, they can't tell you why. So we began fertility treatment. We started with low intervention, a few months on Clomid, then a few IUIs, intrauterine inseminations, and when these failed, we decided to try IVF. And so at this point, we were so thankful for the sound teaching that we'd received at college. There were difficult decisions to make, and I hated that we had to make them, but we felt well prepared, and we were confident in the decisions that we made. And in September 2015, after 18 months of infertility, we fell pregnant on our first round of IVF. We were hugely relieved and so joyful, thinking that our time of waiting and longing was finally behind us. However, things did not go as we'd hoped and prayed they would. When I was 22 weeks pregnant, we were told that my membranes had ruptured prematurely, and 3 days later, I went into labour. Our son Timothy was born on the 30th of December 2015. He was perfect and tiny. He lived for about half an hour, so we had the great joy of meeting him and holding him and see his little tiny hands and legs move and feeling his heartbeat. We read to him from John 14 and Revelation 21 because we wanted him to know where he was going and not be scared. And he died safely in our arms. We are devastated by his absence and we miss him so much. I hate that I have to live the rest of my life without him. Death is a terrible enemy indeed. And yet we do not grieve without hope. We desperately wanted to take Timothy home with us, but we know that he has a far better home in his father's house than the one that we could have given him. We know that we will see him again, and so we long for Jesus' return as we never have before. We trust that our God is good and sovereign and wise, that he loves us and that he will not abandon us. We feel kept by him. But it has been a dreadful 12 months and it continues to be hard. We continue to struggle with our grief and also with our infertility. After Timothy died, I was desperate to be pregnant again. I can never replace Timmy, but we long for children, and I think that expecting another child would help to ease the loss of our first. So we started IVF again in April, and we were so fortunate first time round that it worked first time. I think we were hoping that that would quickly be done with, but 13 months on from Timmy's death, here we are. And so since then we've had 6 embryo transfers and all 6 have failed, and that included a miscarriage in September. So let me share some reflections on how Brian and I have partnered differently in our grief and our infertility. We feel really profoundly that being a man and a woman has really shaped how we've handled this. And these experiences, as awful as they are, have shaped our gospel partnership and made us better in ministry. God has grown us in patience, humility, and compassion. And we hope that he will use us to walk alongside others in their grief and in their infertility. And we hope that others like you can learn from our experiences how to minister to those people. Our grief was different right from the start, and men and women, we quickly learned, grieve differently, and every individual grieves differently, and no way is right or better than the other. My grief was obvious. I cried a lot, and I wanted to talk a lot. I found that by talking, I was able to process my feelings. I wanted to talk about Timothy. I wanted to replay what had happened. I wanted to imagine a future without him and name the things that we'd lost. Talking allowed me to try and make sense of what is incomprehensible. Brian did not cry a lot, and he did not talk a lot. He did not want to rehash the memories. He found going back to be more painful. And this was difficult for me, and I didn't understand it. I thought perhaps that he wasn't as sad as I was, that he didn't care as much about Timmy as I did, that he doesn't miss him as I do. But that wasn't the case. And even though at times I misunderstood Brian, I could not have gotten through that immediate crisis period without him. A good gospel partnership needs a husband who understands what he is called to. And Brian did. He loved me and cherished me and cared for me in my brokenness. He lived out 1 Peter 3:7, understanding my weaker nature and showing me honour. He lived out Ephesians 5. He sacrificed himself for me and put me first. And I don't think this is ever an easy task for a husband, but let alone in the midst of your own unimaginable pain. He has not been perfect, but Brian has kept his vows and partnered with me through the very worst of times. How important it is that men understand, they truly grasp the responsibility they assume when they marry. We learnt that no matter how strong a marriage, you can't rely exclusively on each other, and it is wise to seek and accept help. So we sought counselling very early on, mere weeks after Timmy died. When we were first married, we'd made an agreement that if our marriage ever encountered difficulty, we wouldn't be ashamed to seek counselling. And so having made that decision in the good times enabled us not to even think about it in the crisis. Counselling helped us understand each other better and gave us coping strategies. And we were helped enormously by our Christian brothers and sisters. We're so privileged to be a part of a Christian community where people pray for us and continue to pray for us and serve us. We're so thankful for friends who would drop everything to be with us at a moment's notice. We're so touched by how many people came to the funeral. We were appreciative of the cards and texts and flowers people sent. We were humbled to find an anonymous envelope of cash in our mailbox. A good gospel partnership protects itself, and there were people who hurt us who didn't respond very well to Timothy's death, and so for us that meant putting some distance between ourselves and them. And for us it also meant physical distance. We decided to go away. This was Brian's initiative, and I think that he found it really helpful in the immediate weeks to have something to do and to plan. So a month after Timmy died, we went to the US for 4 weeks. And not everyone will be able to do this, but gosh, we'd encourage grieving people to get away if they can. Because being away was so helpful. We weren't surrounded by people and things that constantly reminded us of our loss. We were freed from the responsibilities and the restraints of everyday life. We were able to do things, but these things weren't burdensome or stressful. And exploring God's creation reminded us of who He is and what He is like. We had space to process our feelings, but plenty of distractions when we needed them. That all sounds very civilised, but our grief was raw and at times ugly. Both of us were selfish, impatient, and said harsh things. And I particularly struggled with envy and not allowing the tragedy to define me. Well, how might you help people in grief? Most importantly, acknowledge their pain. I know it can be awkward and I know you don't know what to say, but there were people who kept silent, who didn't say anything when Timmy died, and this hurt me deeply. Please acknowledge the death of a loved one, or you're saying that their loss isn't significant and worth your time. So send a card, attend the funeral, share memories of their loved ones, speak their name, bring them a meal, pray for them, cut them slack, and help to carry their burdens. Be there when they need you to be, even if it's inconvenient to you. As time goes on, don't forget, remember anniversaries and birthdays, and don't expect that they'll ever get over it. The pain will become easier to live with, but it will always be there, so be in it for the long haul. And please teach on suffering. In God's kindness, we were well taught, and our faith did not waver. But that isn't the case for everyone. We've seen others rail against God and even leave the church in their pain. Make sure your people are well prepared to suffer, because suffer they will in this broken world. And just as our grief was different, we've also coped differently with our infertility. When we had difficult decisions to make, I would often second guess myself, and I was at risk of being paralysed by indecision. A good gospel partnership recognises male headship, and so I'm so grateful to Brian that he took the lead and made those tough calls. And we also realised better than we did that men and women approach family and children and identity differently. Still figuring this out, but infertility and Timmy's death has had a greater impact on my identity and sense of purpose than it has on Brian's. I was planning to move seamlessly from one role to the next. I was going to be a chaplain, then a stay-at-home mum, and now I'm neither. Brian hasn't been affected in the same way. His day-to-day was not going to change in the same way mine was with the arrival of a baby. And so I thought I knew what the next few years looked like. I've learnt the truth of James 4 the hard way. I don't even know what tomorrow will bring, what my life will be. And I found that really difficult, to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing instead of caring for my son. And so last year, it felt like life was just one big waiting room. I was just killing time, waiting to be pregnant again. But I've been convicted that that is an unwise way to live. You can't sit around and wait for something that may never happen. I must get on with what God has given me to do in this season. And while we're in it together, and Brian has been beside me every step of the way, I sometimes feel so incredibly alone. He doesn't feel betrayed by his body as I do. He's able to compartmentalise in a way that I can't. It is never far from my mind. It takes over my life as I go from one appointment to the next. I feel as though my body belongs to a team of doctors and nurses who are privy to every intimate detail. I have been poked and prodded, had blood drawn, and my insides examined more times than I care to count. It is exhausting, and it is consuming, and it is awful. But in all of this, God is teaching us more about himself and his world, and how to use our experiences to serve others. So how can you help people with infertility? Briefly, acknowledge that infertility is painful and isolating and its own kind of grief. Don't underestimate how terrible it can be. Have a solid biblical understanding of infertility and teach explicitly about it so that we can remove the stigma. It would be really helpful as well if you could have a solid practical understanding of artificial reproductive technology, so that if people need your help, you know what you're talking about and you just have a sense of what they're going through in the day-to-day. I'm astounded by how few people actually know what's involved in the nitty-gritty process. It just adds to our feeling of isolation that no one really gets what we're going through. Be willing to offer guidance and helpful principles by all means, but try to avoid being too legalistic or black and white on specific issues you might not have in-depth knowledge about. Encourage people with infertility, therefore, to gather the facts, to do their research before they make decisions, or they might be left with messy consequences. Encourage them to talk to those who've gone before, and if they're able to, get a Christian infertility specialist. As far as I know, there's only one in Sydney, so if you know doctors, encourage them to consider specialising. Having a Christian infertility specialist made our journey so much easier. And so here we are, we carry on. We keep praying and hoping that God will answer our prayers and bless us with another child. We continue to miss Timmy and long for our reunion with him. But as I said, I cannot stay in the waiting room. I have no idea what's ahead, and I think I'm finally learning that I cannot control my life. So I decided to leave Barker, and that was very sad and not how I imagined things ending. But I needed to be brave and leave what is safe and familiar and comfortable and imagine a different life to the one I'd anticipated. I need a fresh start and a new challenge. And so this year brings that. This year, Brian and I will both be on staff at St Swithin's Pymble. We're job sharing. Brian will work 4 days a week and I will work 2, and I'll also be working for Cara Hartley 1 day a week. As Joe said, we think this job sharing arrangement is quite unique in the diocese, and we believe it's the first time the Archbishop has licensed a married couple to both be in paid roles in a church. So we're figuring it out and we're excited. We never planned it, we never anticipated that we'd be working together, but it came about really organically as we saw how well we worked together as a team at St Peter's last year. We're sure that working closely together will bring its challenges, and we'll be figuring out a lot as we go, but we're just so excited to see how God will use us both. So to sum up, what does a good gospel partnership look like? Well, we think a good gospel partnership serves God and his people. And this is the case whether you're both trained or not, both in vocational ministry or not, whatever circumstance you find yourself in. In all the joys and challenges, husbands and wives should support and encourage each other both individually and as a couple to bring God glory. A colleague said to Brian once, "You're good, but Kate makes you gold." And I think the reverse is true, and it's pretty much the best thing anyone's ever said to us. I very much see myself as Brian's helper, and he gives himself up for me, and we're convicted that we work so much better together as a team than we do as individuals.